Well, I guess this is our first intervention lecture, so I will intervene. John Burdick. I'm a professor in anthropology, and I'm also a social activist. And I regard my academic and analytical work and my activism to be closely related to each other. I've tried to bring them into relationship to each other for many, many years. I have been involved in labor organizing in the 1970s, in the UAW, neighborhood organizing in the 1980s, in Detroit, peace and justice work in the 80s and 90s, and currently very involved in peace and justice activism in various ways. And I feel it's important to bring together sort of the perspective of analysis, like how do I understand how society works? How do I understand conflicts work? How do I understand social forces with strategy, with figuring out what's the best way forward, or what are some ideas about how to organize groups of people who are marginalized or excluded from power to remedy injustices, to mobilize and tap into their own indigenous resources, to build alliances, to turn sympathizers into allies, to confront and deal with opponents in order to mobilize resources and people in order to put pressure on power holders so that injustices can be remedied. And what I've just done there is sort of given you a quick definition of how I approach and think about collective action for social change. Because what we're talking about here is a certain kind of politics, right? A certain kind of struggle between different social groups for power. And it's hot politics. It's not cool. It's not quiet. It's contentious. In fact, there's a whole area of study in sociology and in other fields called contentious politics, right? And it's useful to think about this, and if you're interested, the writers who focus on this are people like Doug McAdam and Charles Tilley, who just passed away, and Sidney Tara, and actually my favorite, Francesca Paletta, who all are, they till the vineyard in sociology of contentious politics, social movements, grassroots social activism, and the theoretical perspective that they employ as they look at all this stuff is political process theory. And so what I'm going to do is sort of walk us through some of the key elements of political process theory, but from the point of view not only of an academic, but also of an activist. Like, why is this stuff useful? Because I think it is. I mean, I was just at a meeting yesterday. I'm on a committee of the Syracuse Peace Council where we're organizing both a series of demonstrations, but also a series of efforts to reach out to local churches and to the Service Employees International Union and some other actors, trying to make a specific kind of argument about why continued true presence or growth of true presence in Afghanistan would be damaging to their interests. And so we have to articulate that. And as I think about articulating that argument, thinking about demonstrations, and thinking about the power holders that we're trying to put pressure on and engage with and persuade, this stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today is really very much a part of the way I think. I think about what are our resources, our indigenous resources. I think about what is our political environment in terms of potential allies, bystanders, opponents, adversaries, and so on. I think about frames, how do we frame our arguments, and I think about the specific kinds of tactics that we need to use to get from here to there. So all these are pieces of political process theory. So if you're interested, you should, take a look-see in some of these writers, because I think they're quite helpful. So let me give us a sort of a working definition of the kind of politics that I want us to focus on today. It's a politics that, as I said, is contentious. It's hot politics. It's not cool politics, though it can include cool political action of gentle, quiet, conversational bargaining, negotiation, lobbying, and so forth. It certainly can. And education, outreach, PowerPoint slides and the rest are all part of this kind of politics, but it's a politics in which that is part of a menu. It's part of a repertoire that includes, potentially, always in your back pocket, something a little hotter, something potentially more disruptive, more confrontational, where you're not just engaged in persuasion, but you're engaged in pressure through imposing costs upon your interlocutor. Your interlocutor may actually be uncomfortable at some point, might be ashamed, might lose access to customers, might have their productivity go down because you're threatening a strike, that they can't sell their product because you're threatening a boycott, that they can't depend upon the ease of movement in public spaces because you're threatening a sit-down or an occupation or a demonstration. That is, you're mobilizing resources and people to potentially impose some kind of cost. Now, all of this, in the terms that Gene Sharp uses and others, can be considered nonviolent. But I want to be edgy here with you guys. And I think, Lindsay mentioned that violence itself can be articulated in relationship to complex moral orders. It's easy to say violence is nothing but chaos. And yet in practice, that's not true. Violence is highly ordered. It's highly organized. It's related. There is arbitrary and chaotic violence. But there's also morally ordered violence. And so it's important to think about violence itself as part of a continuum of tactical action, and not to arbitrarily exclude it, but to understand under what circumstances are there. The Catholic Church in the 1960s in Latin America, Camilo Torres and others, were regarded that the best way that they could emulate Jesus Christ was by engaging in armed struggle against the fascist military dictatorships of Central and South America. They articulated that in hundreds and hundreds of pages of liberationist theology. So far be it from me to say that violence in some kind of generic abstract way is always chaotic. I think we need to engage it thoughtfully, critically, but also as part of a continuum of social tactical action. So we're talking about a politics that is about groups of people who have grievances, who are unhappy. They're people who are aggrieved. They may have more or less some kind of identification with each other through that grievance or through other bases of identification. They feel that they do not occupy, either they're right or they're wrong, but they believe that they do not occupy the centers of social power within their societies. They do not enjoy the central instruments of political influence. They're not central, they're marginal. They have either they're powerless or they have less power than others in society. They feel, or they have a growing feeling, that their grievance is actually unjust. Because you can be aggrieved but think, well, I'm not happy, but more or less I deserve what I get, right? So, excluded from centers of power, aggrieved, feeling that grievance is unjust. And, based upon that, coming to the conclusion that the only remedy is collective. I can't do this through patron-clientage. I can't do it individually going to my boss and just dealing with you. I have to join with others, and through our collective action, we will, in exercising various kinds of tactics, be able to put pressure on power holders who will then, through that pressure, act to remedy the injustice. That's the kind of politics I'm talking about. It's not exhaustive. There's a lot of other kinds of politics. A lot. This is one category of politics, and that's what I want to focus on. So this lays out several things for us to think about. As an activist, and now I'm going to engage you guys and ask you to think with me a little bit. As activists in the making, advocates trying to bring about nonviolent social change, and as analysts, as people engaged in intellectual labor, intellectual hard work, right? That's what creates any kind of social value, is putting in time and thinking about stuff. So the first thing is to think about is, if you will, we have to think about, here's the aggrieved group of people, and the first step of a good, smart organizer, going from house to house, having your meeting in the town square, calling folks to the church, whatever you're doing, or just spending as Commandant, the guy in, my mind's in the Zapatista. Right, Marcos. He arrived in La Condon jungle in 1983, and he thought he was going to organize the peasants, and he realized that that was impossible because he didn't understand who the peasants were. And he then spent the next 11 years getting to understand what were the resources of the peasantry in the La Condon jungle. And it was only at that point that some kind of action should take place. So the first step is to understand who you are. Who are we? What do we have? What do we bring to the table? This is actually very, very important, because if the first, as you enter into this situation, having understood, having been socialized, having learned that you have no power, then the first step towards power is to learn what kind of power you do have, and to understand your power, to talk about your power, to articulate your power. Not yet externally, but internally. So, what kind of power would a powerless group, doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't enjoy positions of authority, don't run businesses, don't run factories, aren't presidents and aren't corporate giants, what kind of power do people have? Numbers. Okay. Always potentially. But that then you have to engage in excruciating realism, right? How numerous are we? Right? How large a group are we? But that's fair enough. We got to think about our numbers. Okay, what else? Pardon?
Electoral power, votes.
Okay, that comes in, right? That can translate potentially into electoral. It can translate into other kinds of action. Electoral is one kind of action that's dependent upon numbers. If those numbers are ready to vote in a block, which is not self-evident, even aggrieved groups are internally very fractionated, so there may have to be a lot of work to get to that point, but indeed, true. Yeah?
Could be diversity.
How so?
Like different ethnic religious groups joining in the movement.
So perhaps here you're thinking about certain kinds of solidarities between this group and other groups, or are you thinking about internally to the aggrieved group?
Internally.
Okay. Why is that a source of...
They must have a common cause. They must have a sort of grievance which is common, but which is running through different communities, different ethnic groups.
Now let's think, okay, fair enough that we want to develop a sense of commonality, collective identity, but what's the source of strength? Why is that a resource to have ethnic diversity? Is that a source of strength?
Yeah.
How so? Why would that be a source of strength?
Because they will then start drawing their strength from a larger group.
Mm-hmm. But what do we mean by ethnicity? Why is ethnicity a source of potential political strength? I understand that if you bring different groups together, then you accomplish several goals. You increase your overall numbers. Perhaps you also reduce the ability of power holders to divide and conquer, right? Because ethnicity can be a source of division. And if you're able to sort of weave together certain kinds of ties, that you can do that. But ethnicity itself, why is ethnicity, ethnic identity, is that a source of strength? Is that something when I do an assessment of our resources, I say, well, we have ethnicity on our side. What do I mean by that? Yeah.
The ability to mobilize people, and people feel very passionate about their ethnic identities, so they can be moved to change, to action by that.
All right, so ethnicity, if it's real and it's pre-existing, because sometimes you have to work hard at creating ethnicity. Sometimes, in many contexts, people, you go and you say, you know, like in Brazil, I've done 25 years of work at the grassroots in Brazil with the black movement, with the landless workers movement, Workers' Party, neighborhood associations, and I've worked with groups that are all about movimento negro, the black consciousness movement. We go into a neighborhood and, you know, they have an educational event about black identity. You don't hardly get anybody. I said, well, you're all black. I say, many of us are not. We're moreno, we're mulatto, we're mestiço. We don't identify with negro. And those of us who do, negro, in terms of the hierarchy of things that we're concerned about, you know, somewhere around here. What we're most concerned about is the fact that we're living in a favela that doesn't have, you know, clean water and doesn't have bus service, and, you know, and the police are brutal to all of us irrespective of our ethnic identity. So indeed, ethnicity can be, but not necessarily. And so it's important to do a really careful, thoughtful assessment. And one of the biggest mistakes that organizers make is to think that they know things. That is the key to the failure of grassroots social organizing, is to assume you understand things. Because most of the time you don't. What you do is you have to go and hang out and get to know and learn what it is that really is on people's minds. What is it that people really are worried about? What is it that people really want? Because outsiders, we think we know. And here's where, you know, the outside organizer versus someone who has spent their whole life inside of an aggrieved group, that kind of relationship is often incredibly crucial, right? An outside organizer may have access to all sorts of networks, all sorts of resources that can be incredibly useful to the process of organizing and mobilizing, right? But here you can see, I'm not even yet at the point of mobilization. Mobilization, in many ways, is cheap and easy and not necessarily very fruitful. Mobilizing just means getting people off their duffs to get them into central places. The hardest work is organizing. The hardest work is getting people to develop a common collective set of commitments in which they understand the world in a similar way that can sustain a whole variety of actions, including mobilization. Mobilization is actually only one of a whole number of things that you can do together, right? Sometimes the most important thing is to not mobilize. The most effective thing you can do in many situations is to not mobilize. If you mobilize, it's an invitation to destruction and the end of the movement. Because if you do a careful analysis of the political context, if you mobilize, the police will simply destroy you. But if you remain embedded, if you remain an embedded network acting in a dispersed fashion, and you're communicating with each other, then you can bring about more long-term social change. But when somebody comes along, depending on the political context, and says, we need to mobilize and have everybody come, if you've done your political analysis very well, you know that that guy is a saboteur. He's trying to destroy your movement. So we have to be very realistic about political context here. So good. So ethnicity can be a resource, but not always, not automatic. What else? What else, if I look internally to the group, what are some other resources? Sometimes we call them social capital. What's other stuff that you want to, yeah?
I have to say labor and manpower.
Okay. Labor. Let's think about what we mean by labor. Labor, there's such a thing as, you know, this is labor, right? But am I engaging in other kinds of labor right now? I am. What other kind of labor? What kind of labor are you involved in right now?
Mental labor, creative power.
Absolutely, right? Got to really be aware that people are engaged in all sorts of kinds of labor, right? They've got skill, they've got knowledge, they've got understanding that pre-exists often our weak, frail attempts to come in and raise their consciousness. We have to learn what kind of consciousness they already have, what kind of deep collective memories they have. I remember a few years ago, a group of people organized in the Partnership for Onondaga Creek trying to organize people on the south side of Syracuse of Syracuse on the Midland Avenue to get people to get, riled up about the fact that the county was going to build a waste treatment plant on Midland Avenue, and we would go from house to house. And some houses, people were like, yes, right, this is shit, we got to get together and, fight. Another house, same socioeconomic class, same ethnicity, same everything. Get out of here. Well, we didn't understand this, but little by little we understood what the pattern was. The houses where people were ready to engage in action, were feeling militant, were pissed off, those were people who had memory of what happened back in the 60s when I-81 was built and the whole neighborhood was decimated. They brought knowledge, they brought memory, that was an incredible resource, right? The others were more recent arrivals, they had no connection to the neighborhood, they didn't understand that, they didn't have that network relationship or that memory. So labor is also about knowledge, it's about skill, it's about memory. It's about all those things that you bring in through your ability to act in the world through your body and your mind. Very good. Other stuff. What else do you bring? What other resources do people already have? What other power do they have? Yes?
One another. As in, you're already a community, and there's already the familiarity there, and the lines of communication most likely are already there as well.
Excellent. Now let's operationalize that, because community is one of the most overused terms we've got, right? Let's think about what are the sources of solidarities and common, commonness in a place.
It can be values, it can be your church group, it can be
Okay. Well, let's think about two things. They're organizationally what pre-exists, that already there's all sorts of organizational stuff that's already happening. I can't really underline how important this is. Because thinking about this internationally, one of also the great failures and stresses upon NGOs. NGOs are people generally staffed by people who think they understand the world, right? They're masters of the universe in various ways. And they come in, they've got their degrees, or they've got various urban kinds of educations, and they've got their whiteness, they've got their class standing, they've got their networks, they've got all sorts of things, right? And they come in and they figure, we've got something to teach. We know something that people here don't know. And they're right, but they're usually wrong about what it is. We're going to teach people how to develop citizenship. We're going to teach people how to be democratic. We're going to teach people how to solve their problems. There's something wrong with this picture. Because shouldn't it be, why don't we find out what they already are doing? How do they solve their problems? How do they settle their conflicts? How do they deal with the tensions and stresses that they already have? What are their social and human resources, organizations? What about their churches? What about their clubs? What about their networks, informal and formal? What about kinship, right? What about neighborhood? What about family? What about all of these things, right? So right off the bat, I think NGOs are a blessing upon them. They've got lots of incredible stuff to bring, but it's usually things they learn as they realize, they say, oh, now I understand what I have to bring. I'm not going to teach you how to be democratic, right? I may be able to link you into various kinds of international networks to have solidarity with what you're already doing and to empower and enable what you're already up to, right? But this notion that I have some kind of wisdom that I'm going to impart, that begins to erode after a little while. But so organizationally, right, all sorts of stuff. And I'm sorry, I have to refer to you as the bunny. The lady with the bunny ears, what's your name?
Helen.
Helen. But you also said something else, because you said the church, right, and the churches are really important nodes of organization. They bring people together, they've got places that people can meet and so on. Often they've got things like telephones and all sorts of cool stuff like that. But you also said something about values. Tell us more, what do you mean?
It can be from family values to just if there a community that, like you said, are, they're poor and, sort of, it just wants, I don't know, I guess, access to have better lives. I mean, they already share in their, whatever their social problems might be, they already have that together, and so, wanting something better.
Okay, but I also was thinking about in relationship to the church, because in the church, there's religion, right? How about religion? Something that some people are sort of like, oh, let's not talk about religion. We're a secular institution. Yeah.
But it can also, it's the church also, but I mean, it can also be education as well. I mean, school faculty and the parents that are involved with the children's education. That's another type of value as well. So.
Okay. How about your reading of a holy book? Do you think that that might be a resource? Your reading of the Quran, your understanding of the Quran, your understanding of the Bhagavad Gita, your understanding of the Old Testament, the New Testament. Is that a resource, or is that kind of a peripheral adornment that we should sort of set aside? What do you think? Who here thinks that religion might be a resource? Very good. I agree. All right. But we can't understand the landless workers movement in Brazil without understanding its rootedness in religion, for example. Right? Can't understand what you guys are already talking about, the civil rights movement. Doesn't make sense for us to even begin to talk about the civil rights movement without connecting it to all sorts of ideas about social gospel and reading of the Bible as a manifesto for social justice and so on. Okay. So there's a lot more here. I want to get us just into the groove of, that first step of political process, which is assessing what are the resources, the powers, the capacities that, at least on the surface, a powerless group of people brings into this process. Okay, so that's looking inward. Then you have to look outward, and the second step is to think about political environment, or as these guys often refer to it, political opportunity. And it's not just opportunity in the positive sense, it's also constraint. It's both what that political environment can make possible in terms of allies, in terms of accessing new networks beyond the community or beyond your aggrieved group, but also what that political environment disables or hinders or makes more difficult. And a lucid political actor understands the range of what's going on, or tries to understand both what we're dealing with in terms of potential resources beyond our community, and also what we're dealing with in terms of constraint. So what are some of the things that come to mind when you're looking outward?
Allies and networks.
Pardon?
Allies with other groups and networks.
Can you give me an example?
Similar groups which have the similar set of problems in another area.
Okay, so there's similarity. So to see what can we learn from their experience, and a lot of this, again, very important to realize something. Often when we think about resources and what we get, there's a kind of a naive materialism, which is, what kind of material support can they provide? What kind of lists of people? In my experience, that's very important, but only about a tenth or a fifth of what's most important. Most of what's important is knowledge. What can you tell us about your experience? What did you do that worked? What worked well? Tell us about your strategies. Tell us about your tactics. Give us some ideas. Ideas. They're very, it's amazing. They're sort of low when you think about things. Say, oh, ideas, yeah, but what's most important is money. No, actually, money doesn't add up to a whole hill of beans if you don't have a good strategy. Frittering it away. So, indeed, allies, to enter into communication, to learn, to communicate. What did you guys do? How are you doing it? Tell us. Give us some, ideas about how to deal with our situation. All right. So similarity, but then also allies. I'm thinking about the Montgomery bus boycott because the civil rights movement. The African American men and women in 1955, 1956, who refused to go onto buses in Montgomery, Alabama, one of the important first mobilizations and organizational processes of the civil rights movement. They did have allies that were like them in other cities throughout the South. In fact, they turned to other groups that had done boycotts. It wasn't the first boycott, it was the third or fourth boycott in the South in that period. But there was another group right inside of Montgomery, Alabama that was absolutely crucial in terms of an ally that was not similar. Illustrative. A lot of the women who walked to work instead of taking buses were domestic servants, right? They had to get to houses. And guess who wanted them to get to their houses? And they said, you know what? I need you here at 8 o'clock. All right, how many in your neighborhood? I'll drive over in my station wagon. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded for a number of reasons, one of which was the tactical support of white middle and upper class women who wanted their black servants to get to work. Now, one of the things that unleashed was that for the first time, those white women found themselves on the other side of Montgomery, Alabama. And their consciousness was raised. Because for every morning, for 40, 45 minutes, they were in cars with women that they'd never talked to before. This is how sort of movements worked. They became the cell, the core of the Southern women's movement. Those women who began to think across lines of class and race not all of them, but a group of them became incredibly important in developing the Southern women's rights movement. So that was to get us to think about, the other groups outside. They became allies. They were bystanders. They became sympathizers, and they became allies through a process, a sort of several-step process. All right, so you have allies. How about, what are other actors in this environment here that you have to be thinking about? Actually, I have to give you one more, there's allies. I have to think about the state here, though, because the state is a crucial actor, right? A state includes things like police, right? Judges, this is all, about law, politicians and policymakers, right? There's a whole apparatus of power. And relating to the state, understanding it as a set of constraints and also potential enablers and resources is very important. We live in this society in a country with a constitution that has a Bill of Rights. Sometimes it's implemented beautifully, sometimes it kind of stumbles along, but at least it's there on paper, right? So that if we assemble more than 2 or 3 people in a single place, presumably by the very fact that we're assembled, the police don't have a right to come in and break us up. We do have a right to, send a letter to the editor that is critical of the president, right? So there's freedom of speech. So there's a legal context in which there's a certain kind of room for maneuver, and we have to be aware of that. That is in no way, shape, or form universal in the world, right? That varies from country to country, society to society, and internally about what the legal environment is. Yeah.
The political system also would be very relevant, because if the political system is such that which provides for opportunities for upward mobility and representation in the political system, I think that would become a major enabler. Whereas the other part, like if it's a more repressive system, then it could disable the entire movement.
Absolutely. All right. that a good political actor needs to understand what you're dealing with in terms of the willingness and capacity of the state to repress, the openings and channels of access already that pre-exist your movement into the state in terms of mobility, and just how static the situation is. It is an art form, and there's a lot of bad artists out there in terms of political organizers and activists, and some good ones. It's an art form because you have to make a judgment about just how fluid the situation is. You need to know a lot. You need to read signs. For example, around the police. Police forces are always potentially a force for repression, but they're also always potentially a force for fraternization. And understanding where you're at in relationship to police forces is often a crucial resource that organizers and activists have. I'll give you an example. May 1963, since we're talking about the civil rights movement, Birmingham, Alabama. One of the great political organizers, in a moment we'll hear his rhetoric when we turn to framing, Martin Luther King was not just a great speaker, he was also a very savvy strategist because he understood political environments and political opportunities, and he read the state. He understood, he played the state like a flute. I mean, he was sometimes not so well, like in Albany, Georgia, but often very, very well. And what he did in Birmingham, Alabama in spring of 1963 was he read that Bull Connor, who was the sheriff, the head of the police department, would use violence, would repress violently, would turn the hoses and the dogs. And he knew that this would happen, and it was precisely because he knew it that he knew that they needed to have their biggest demonstrations and sit-downs and marches in Birmingham. Because he read the situation politically that if images of hoses and dogs were projected to constituencies of Democratic congresspeople in the North, that they would increase the likelihood of a passage of the Civil Rights Act. They needed that. And so things worked out just as Martin Luther King planned. What people don't know is that he knew something else. Because he wanted there to be repression. He wanted there to be powerful images. But he wanted his people not to lose hope. And so part of what he did was the choice of Birmingham came out of deep local knowledge of the police force and the firefighters of Birmingham, Alabama. The firefighters in particular. The firefighters were engaged in a labor struggle. They had a iffy relationship with the city managers and with the administration of the city. And he knew that they would go only so far. Well, he wasn't sure, but he thought they would. And so all the images that we have of Birmingham on a spring day in May are from the morning. But by the afternoon, when those kids went into some of the public parks, and they went down on their knees, and they started to pray, and they made a line of prayer and talked about nonviolence. Nonviolence doesn't work in the abstract. It always works in particular political conjunctures. When you read the capacity and willingness of states to repress. There are lots of states that don't give a damn. They don't give a damn. So you're nonviolent, that makes it easier for us. All right? But in the context of Birmingham in spring of 1963, when these people went down on their knees and started to pray, the firemen put down their hoses. They refused to repress. And it was at that moment that the city realized that it no longer could control the situation. And it's interesting to analyze moments of political shift. It is often when the forces of order refuse the states, those who are giving orders, that is the actual implementers, the police or the firefighters. So I give that as an example because the police don't automatically repress. You, as an actor, you have to be able to read that. All right, judges, law. All right, so state. What else? What's another part of the political environment? Yeah.
Well, I would say if you have your allies, you'd have to have your enemies up there as well.
Absolutely. What, can you give me an example? What's an example of an enemy?
I hadn't thought of one, but just basically anybody whose mission is opposed to yours. Like, I mean, you have the state and the actors, but who within that state structure, for example, is opposed to your values or views, or you know, what is that inherent barrier? Who are the actors keeping that up?
Mm-hmm. Indeed, right? And a good political organizer understands also what is rigid and what's fluid. This is also incredibly important because, you know, there's a facile outsider's notion of, you know, in fact, I know I face this all the time. You know, I'm going to study conflict resolution. I'm going to study negotiation. I'm going to study these things. Social movements, that's for people who are kind of crazed. Those are hotheads, right? Those are people, well, you know what? That really doesn't do justice to, in practice, what activists do. Because good activists make very careful differentiations. They say, you know, is this an actor that really is, you know, rigidly opposed to our interests? Or are we able to exert some kind of influence? Can we begin to turn that opponent into maybe a neutral, or potentially a sympathizer, or potentially even an ally? I was engaged 2 years ago in a long process, and I'm very involved in the local peace and justice movement, very against U.S. policy in Iraq. I'm just for transparency, right? And James Walsh, you know, the congressman here, had voted consistently with the he's a Republican, and can vote consistently with Bush on everything, and certainly had been supportive of the policy in Iraq for years. But some of us also recognize he's a good, God-fearing Catholic. He had been very sympathetic to arguments around closing Fort Benning, the School of the Americas, which trained people, including folks that are alleged to have engaged in massacres against nuns. In other words, he was someone who, in other issues, had shown a certain willingness to listen, to be in the sandbox and play. And so we said, you know, maybe if we had a petition that we went into neighborhoods where he could recognize the zip codes as belonging to his traditional constituencies of, you know, of Republicans, where people are not that thrilled with this policy. Maybe if we did A, B, or C, because at the start of the conversation was, Walsh is our enemy. Walsh is on the other side. So I was like, yeah, wait a second. You know, Walsh is a power holder, and we don't need him to become our friend. We're not ready. We're not saying let's go off and start, you know, picking out furniture together. But maybe we can go on a weekend trip. Maybe we can go to the mall. Maybe we can go to a movie together. You know, let's have a little courting. And it's perfectly reasonable to think about it. It's a relationship. All this is about conversation. At the end of the day, it's sitting down and having a conversation with somebody. So I say that because, indeed, you have to be clear about opponents, but you also have to be ready to play and to move. And indeed, I mean, the reason I bring up that story, not shockingly, is that we got him on our side. I mean, he claimed there were a number of forces, but I don't know if you remember, a couple years ago, he finally came out and he turned against U.S. policy. There were many factors, one of which I believe were the 3,000 signatures that we put on his desk, including many of his traditional constituents. Right? So, yeah, opponents. Yes, Lindsay.
I'm not sure where this would fit exactly, so bear with me, but I'm just thinking, especially at the international level, it's important to kind of understand a broader context. Things like norms. I'm thinking, for example, you know, the U.S., we subscribe to human rights norms.
Mm-hmm.
During the civil rights movement, we were also in the Cold War. And so we were projecting Russia as being this horrible government that would oppress their citizens and didn't respect human rights. And our
government was really bad because at the same time Russia was saying, well, look what they do in America, look what they do to African Americans, and so that was one of the reasons why the government was so keen on wrapping this up and having some more equality in the US. So if you understand the broader scope, it does kind of translate at the local level.
Lindsay, great point. It's important to sort of think about this as concentric circles and to think about, where can we link in, where do we have the capacity to do that. A lot of this is to be excruciatingly realistic about what you can do. I mean, very often you can't. But if you can, but the other point I would underline here is that you began by talking about norms, which is very, very important. You can think about norms and values and ideas. It's really important to think about this as two sides of a coin because there's material and organizational realities about networks and people and phone numbers and offices and resources and Xerox machines and cell phones and all the kinds of things that people have that help them do things, right? But what are they helping them to do? They're helping them to realize what's in their heads, their beliefs, their goals, their ideals, their fantasies, their dreams, all those things. And as they do that increasingly together and articulated in various ways, those become normative, right? Those become common property. Those things become things that we can agree on. So rather than sort of separate these things out, Lindsay, and saying they're just two different compartments, it's good to see how they work together. They do, because you begin organizationally to work with a particular network, and you begin to learn and develop a sense of what those norms are. Or you begin with, who has norms that are similar to ours, or who can help us? Oh, that's a network. And you sort of begin to link in that way. But I think you can go in either way. You enter into it in different ways. Now to move forward, this is again, just to get you thinking about not only the internal, but the external. And I know, because I have two more things I want to get through. Approach it. All right, the third big piece of the first ingredient is understanding your own social resources, social capital, indigenous resources, if you will, understanding the political environment, and then now you're ready. Now you're ready. Now you have to articulate. Now, interesting, often we think about social action as, all right, I'm going to gather everybody together, and we're going to go and do our demonstration, we're going to do our protest. About what? I'm going to go protest. What? Oh, I'm going to protest the war. Well, you can do that. And how many people are going to go to that? The people who are already angry about the war, and then the war ends and they're gone? Or maybe somebody gets up and says something that a few people don't like because they came because they wanted to protest the war. And we have to articulate. What is it that we want? What is it that we think we can do? What is it that we're trying to do? We have to use language. And we always learn this, right, in elementary school. Use words. Now, I think you use symbols, use sound, use music, use ideas, use symbols, but you have to articulate a message. And this is not about propaganda. It's about developing an understanding, a public analysis that resonates with your targeted constituencies. So that what you're engaged in doing politically is precisely beginning to turn your opponents into bystanders, sympathizers, and allies. You're trying to activate your natural constituency already who are part of your grief group, that they can translate that grief into a set of hopes and dreams for the future. But you have to use language. And there's certain pieces of this. You have to develop a compelling, resonant frame. Lots of movements fall apart because activists think, okay, I got my indigenous resources, I understand my political environment, let's go. Let's go right to tactics. Well, you're missing a step. You have to articulate what it is that you are trying to do. And the pieces you have to diagnose, there has to be some kind of analysis. You have to diagnose. You have to say, what do you think is going on? Why is the situation unjust? Who is screwing whom? Who is making life hard for whom? What is going on? Right? You have to not only diagnose, you have to have a prognosis. You have to be looking forward. You have to describe where you're going to. What is it that you would like to do? Where you want to go. But you can't just say any old thing. You have to say things that are credible. Because I can say, follow us and we are going to transform the world. You say like, you know what? You're asking me to take risks. You're asking me to miss my soap opera. You're asking me to, in the evening, I usually try after I cook dinner to study for the classes that I'm taking because I'm interested in my own education, my own mobility. You're asking me to sacrifice that. Not every night, just one night a week. One night a week is a lot, right? So if you're going to ask me to do that, you better be credible. You better use language in a way that convinces me that you understand my reality, that you understand what's happening on the ground, that you understand the local reality. You can't just sort of traipse in here and start spitting, generalities, all right? So it has to be credible, it has to be plausible. And actually the other side of this is you have to show me not just that you understand things, but that you get my experience. That you're not external to it. There has to be some kind of experiential convergence. That the fact that I can't get onto the bus, and that dehumanizes me. That's not just a simple matter of we're going to get onto the buses. But if I'm going to stick with you, if you're going to get me to be active, then you have to show me that you get that for me to have to, when the bus stops and I'm going to go onto the front, I have to go onto the front of the bus, take out 10 cents, put it into the little machine. And at that point, I turn around, I get off the bus, I have to go to the back, and I have to get onto the bus. And that little gesture is a world historical dehumanizing moment. You have to get it. You have to show me that you get it. All right? So there has to be something experiential here. All right? I'm going to read to you a speech. All right? Diagnosis and remedy, empirical credibility, experiential. One more. I didn't get them all. Narrativity. You have to tell me a story. You have to show me why this struggle is part of a bigger story. Because I know I'm going to fight now, I'm going to try to bring about some change, but for me to sustain my energy, you have to show me that this is part of a bigger struggle, something that goes beyond just what's happening right now. Give me a narrative. Tell me a larger story. Put it into a bigger framework, all right? You might get me to be involved in the short run, but for me to invest my time and energy in the long run, I need to see a big picture, all right? And that's where you're going to sort of tap into cultural themes and things that are important to me culturally, religiously. There has to be some kind of connection. All right, I'm going to now read to you, and the only reason I'm doing this is that Neil Katz insists on it. As I made the mistake of doing this a year or so ago, and he said, John, every time you come to this class, you have to read that. So if you get bored, it's Neil's fault. It's not mine. This is the evening, Monday evening, December 5th, 1955. On Thursday, the previous Thursday, Rosa Parks had gone into a bus and had been asked to get off the bus, or to get up and leave the seat so that a white man could sit down, and she had refused. She'd been arrested and brought and charged and fingerprinted, and the NAACP over the weekend had the guy, what's his name, Ed Nixon, had gone and conversed with Rosa Parks, and they'd agreed that they were going to use this as a test case and that they were going to bring this to court. but that they realized that in order for this to happen, and for them to really win this, they were going to have to mobilize the whole African American community of Montgomery. And that the churches were going to have to do this. And so over the course of the next few days, the different black churches of Montgomery came together and they formed an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. 20 minutes, because he was elected in the afternoon around 4 o'clock. He went home, and Coretta said he had to eat, and so she made him dinner, and he said, I have to write. She says, just eat first. He goes to his study, he sits down, he writes this, and he had to rush off to the church by 7 o'clock for the meeting. So as I read this, I want you to think about the elements here. What makes it credible, experiential? What's the narrative? What is the prognosis? What is the diagnosis? What makes this urgent? Because this is the speech that started the civil rights movement. My friends, we are certainly very happy to see each of you out this evening. We are here this evening for serious business. Yes, that's right. We are here in the general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens. That's right. And we are determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning. Yeah, that's right. We are here also because of our love of democracy. Yes. Because of our deep-seated belief that democracy transformed from thin paper to thick action is the greatest form of government on earth. That's right, that's right. But we are here in a specific sense because of the bus situation in Montgomery. Yes. We are here because we are to get the situation corrected. This situation is not at all new. The problem has existed over endless years. For many years now, Negroes in Montgomery and so many other other areas have been inflicted with the paralysis of crippling fears on buses in our community. That's right. On so many occasions, Negroes have been intimidated and humiliated and oppressed because of the sheer fact that they are Negroes. That's right. I don't have time this evening to go into the history of these numerous cases. Many of them now are lost in the thick fog of oblivion. But at least one stands before us now with glaring dimensions. Just the other day, just last Thursday to be exact, one of the finest citizens in Montgomery, not one of the finest Negro citizens, but one of the finest citizens in Montgomery, was taken from a bus and carried to a jail and arrested because she refused to get up to give her seat to a white person. Yes, that's right. Now the press would have us believe that she refused to leave a reserved section for Negroes. But I want you to know this evening that there is no reserved section. The law has never been clarified on that point. Now I think I speak with legal authority. Now, not that I have any legal authority, but I think I speak with legal authority behind me that the law, the ordinance, the city ordinance, has never been totally clarified. Mrs. Rosa Parks is a fine person. Well said. By the way, they have in parentheses, the congregation is responding. That's why I have the other voice there. And since it had to happen, I'm happy that it happened to a person like Mrs. Parks. For nobody can doubt the boundless reach of her integrity. Nobody can doubt the height of her character. Nobody can doubt the depth of her Christian commitment and devotion to the teachings of Jesus. And I'm happy since it had to happen. It happened to a person that nobody can call a disturbing factor in the community. Mrs. Parks is a fine Christian person, unassuming, and yet there is integrity and character there. And just because she refused to get up, she was arrested. And you know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. And at that point, the whole place explodes. Thundering applause. They're standing up and starting to yell. There comes a time, my friends, when people get tired of being plunged across the abyss of humiliation, where they experience the bleakness of nagging despair. You keep talking, you keep talking. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. There comes a time, at that point, the crowd doesn't even allow him to continue. They're standing, they're screaming, they're crying. So he's touched some kind of nerve at this point. Finally, they quiet him. We are here this evening because we're tired now. The whole place explodes again. Something like tired. And I want to say that we are not here advocating violence. No. We have never done that. Repeat that, repeat that. I want it to be known throughout Montgomery and throughout this nation that we are a Christian people. We believe in the Christian religion. We believe in the teachings of Jesus. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest. That's all. The place explodes again. Quiets down. And certainly this is the glory of America with all its faults. This is the glory of our democracy. If we were incarcerated behind the Iron Curtains on the communistic nation side, we couldn't do this. If we were dropped in the dungeon of a totalitarian regime, we couldn't do this. But the great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right. My friends, don't let anybody make us feel that we should be compared in our actions with the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council. There will be no crosses burned at any bus stops in Montgomery. There will be no white persons pulled out of their homes and taken out on some distant road and lynched for not cooperating. There will be nobody among us who will stand up and defy the Constitution of this nation. We only assemble here because of our desire to see right exist. My friends, I want it to be known that we're going to work with grim and bold determination to gain justice on the buses in this city. And this here I would say is the key paragraph. And we are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. The Supreme Court that in 1954 had ruled in Brown versus Board of Education against the segregation of public schools. And if we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. Explosion again of applause. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. The place explodes once more. Quiets down. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer that never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie and love has no meaning. And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I want to say that in all of our actions we must stick together. Unity is the great need of the hour. And if we are united, we can get many of the things that we not only desire, but which we justly deserve. And don't let anybody frighten you. We are not afraid of what we are doing, because we are doing it within the law. There is never a time in our American democracy that we must ever think we're wrong when we protest. We reserve that right. When labor all over this nation came to see that it would be trampled over by capitalist power, it was nothing wrong with labor getting together and organizing and protesting its rights. We, the disinherited of this land, we who have been oppressed for so long, were tired of going through the long night of captivity. And now we are reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. May I say to you, my friends, as I come to a close, and just giving some idea of why we are assembled here, that we must keep, and I want to stress this in all of our doings and all of our deliberations here this evening, and all of the week and while, whatever we do, we must keep God in the forefront. Let us be Christian in all of our actions. But I want to tell you this evening that it is not enough for us to talk about love. Now listen to this. Love is one of the pivotal points of the Christian faith. There's another side called justice. And justice is really love in calculation. Justice is love correcting that which revolts against love. That was the core meaning of the Civil Rights Movement. The Almighty God himself is not the God just standing out saying through Hosea, I love you, Israel. He's the God that stands up before the nations and says, be still and know that I am God, that if you don't obey me, I will break the backbone of your power and slap you out of the orbits of your international and national relationships. Standing beside love is always justice. And we are only using the tools of justice. Not only are we using the tools of persuasion, but we've come to see that we've got to use the tools of coercion. Not only is this thing a process of education, it is also a process of pressure. And as we stand and sit here tonight, as we prepare ourselves for what lies ahead, let us go out with a grim and bold determination that we are going to stick together. We are going to work together. Right here in Montgomery, when the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of people, a black people, fleecy locks and black complexion, a people who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights. And thereby they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and of civilization. And we're going to do that. God grant that we will do it before it is too late. As we proceed with our program, let us think